Welcome to Quantum Flux, the podcast of Non-Local Science Fiction Magazine and NonLocalSci-Fi.com. I'm your host, the editor of Non-Local Science Fiction, Dan Dombrowski. The first issue of Non-Local Science Fiction is available now. It features 8 fantastic short stories and the first chapters of 2 thrilling serials. You can buy DRM-free copies of the first issue on NonLocalSci-Fi.com. You can also find the magazine on sites like Amazon, iBooks, and the Nook Marketplace by Barnes & Noble. Be sure also to check out NonLocalSci-Fi.com for all sorts of additional content, including movie and book reviews, rereads and rewatches of genre classics, and the forums at NonLocalSci-Fi.com, an open community for sci-fi lovers from around the world where you can talk to authors from our latest issues and discuss the goings-on in the world of science fiction. I'm joined today by Nicholas Rossis, author of the short story Shoot the Devil, which appears in issue number 1 of Non-Local Science Fiction. Nicholas is the author of several books, most of which are self-published, including his short story collection The Power of Six, his children's book Runaway Smile, and his best-selling epic sci-fi series Perseus. The 4th book in the Perseus series, Schism, which is actually a prequel to the original trilogy, was released earlier this year. Nicholas is one of the reasons I can say that non-local science fiction includes stories from authors around the world. He joins us today via Skype from his home just outside Athens, Greece. Welcome to the podcast, Nicholas.
Hi, Dan. Great to meet you here.
Let's start out, as we usually do, talking about your contribution to the first issue of Non-Local, Shoot the Devil. Where did the idea for the story come from?
Actually, we were having a dinner with a friend, and I started telling them how I was now an author, because we hadn't met up in a while, and they didn't realize that it was this serious, and they just thought it was a bit of a hobby. And they started saying, "Oh, right, so what kind of things do you write about?" And I said, "Oh, anything. I really like short stories, for example." And they said, "Oh, what kind of short stories?" And I said, well, I gave them a couple of examples from The Power of Six. And they were intrigued, so we started shooting ideas to each other about what kind of short stories would interest us. And somehow we ended up with that idea. So it was almost a collaborative thing, almost.
Yeah, and obviously we don't want to spoil the surprise. To even just say what the idea was that started you off is going to ruin the twist at the end of that, or towards the end of that anyway. So we won't get too far into the whole story.
Absolutely.
You leave your main character without a name, and the story is told through a first-person perspective. It really allows the reader to feel like they're part of the story. It makes everything feel very personal. Was that a specific intention in how you planned the story, or did it just come out that way?
And I'm very happy you asked that question, actually, because there is this whole thing I have with names. And my idea is that the fewer names and the fewer terms the story has, the better it can be read. So, and the better the reader can identify with the main character, but also the easier it is for them to remember what everybody does. So we don't really, in our life, we don't really use names, I think, in our heads. We go to the bakers, and we don't say, "Oh, this is John or Jack or whatever." We just say, "I'm going to the bakers." So we have roles assigned to people instead of names, and that's the impression I get. So it's, in my mind, it's easier always to remember in my stories. So here's the scientist, and here's the president, and here's the boss, and here's the secretary. So I have a distinct dislike for names in the stories. Interesting that you pointed out.
The story itself has some pretty heavy religious overtones to it. Is it a reflection of your own personal spirituality, or were you just experimenting with some different viewpoints?
I am very religious, if that's what you're asking. I was brought up a Greek Orthodox. And I sort of define myself as an agnostic Greek Orthodox in the sense that I say I choose to believe to be a Greek Orthodox and a Christian, but at the same time I'm very aware of the fact that there is no logical reason why I should do this. It's all a question of faith. And my personal philosophy has been very much influenced by a number of different sources like Zen Buddhism and Taoism. And indeed, I have translated the Tao Te Ching, which is the cornerstone of Taoism, into Greek, just because I'm personally so influenced by it that I wanted to share that with the rest of the Greeks.
That's fantastic. So is that something that's publicly available?
That is publicly and freely available. I have a website, drching.gr, which is dedicated to just that project, so people can download the book from there for free. But they can also buy it on Amazon. as long as they speak Greek, of course.
Sure, certainly it wouldn't do a lot of people stateside a whole lot of good, I don't think. But that's great that you undertook that project.
It was a fascinating project, I have to tell you.
Uh,
It was very interesting because translating something that's so different to your own mindset. Chinese is a beautiful language, but it's a very strange language to us in the West. And that the expression, the English expression, it's all Greek to me. In Greece, we say it's all Chinese to me. So it was very interesting from that point of view. It took me a year, literally a year, to translate something like 80 verses or something.
And how did you? So you were translating it from the original, from the Mandarin?
Both. I had to teach myself a bit of Mandarin, but it was like just a splash of it. I mean, very little. But I took a number of English translations, maybe half a dozen of them, maybe a bit more, because if you include all the stuff that I tried to find on the internet, it was dozens of translations. And the whole point was to find out what the intent behind the words were. And I ended up doing a dual translation. So on the left-hand side, on the left page, you would get the literal translation, which is almost incomprehensible. And on the right-hand side, I would do a free translation, where I would focus more on the meaning than the words.
Getting back to Shoot the Devil, it's actually the only story in the first issue that I directly solicited. You and I connected via, I think it was Twitter, back in October or November last year. You were looking for people to read and review your short story collection, The Power of Six, and I volunteered. I could tell after reading it that you and I had some influences in common. I liked your style. I asked if you had any other stories you might be interested in sending my way, and you very quickly sent me Shoot the Devil. I was a little surprised when I read it because it does clearly have such strong sociopolitical and religious influences, while the stories in The Power of Six are more traditional golden age hard sci-fi stories that are mostly just fun and entertaining. Which would you say is closer to your true identity as a writer?
Whew. An interesting question. I think all of it, in a sense. I do have a light side and I do have a heavy side. Closer to my core as an individual, I would say it's Shoot the Devil and that sort of storytelling, which I'd like to think also carries a fun side to it, though.
Having read so much of what you've published, it's fairly easy for me to draw a straight line through, The Power of Six, to Shoot the Devil, to the Perseus series. Let's talk a little bit about Perseus. First, can you give us a quick little blurb, a little intro for folks who aren't familiar with the series?
Sure. The idea is that in a few years from now, we will have developed the first warp engine, effectively, so faster than light, which is a staple of science fiction, and it's just used basically to allow people to travel among stars. Something goes horribly wrong, and a bunch of people end up on a remote planet that they have no idea where they are. No one can reach them, so they have to start afresh. And it's a story of what happens 300 years later, effectively. So the first book, which is a prequel, which you very correctly identified as the fourth book, though. So I'm sorry if that's confusing. That's Schism, and that book refers to what happens, effectively lays out the foundation, how they ended up on the planet. But the rest of the books pick up the story 300 years later. And essentially, it's a story of the Greek-Persian Wars, if you like, only in space. The whole idea grew in me because I grew up in Dionysus, which is a place nearby Athens, which is about 20 minutes away from Marathon Bay, where the main battle between the Persians and the Greeks was fought about 2,500 years ago. Yes, 2,500 years ago. So I always thought it was fascinating. And then I saw all of Martin's work, and I was like, it's a good idea to have actual history only taken into the fantasy realm and science fiction realm. So what's stopping me from doing that? And that's just what I wanted to do with Perseus.
When you say Martin, I assume you're talking about George R. R. Martin and the Song of Ice and Fire series?
Absolutely, yes.
You're a big fan of that series?
I do very much like the series, and I haven't watched. I've only watched the first season on TV because I kept reading the books, and I noticed that the series started deviating from the books. So I wanted to focus on one or the other, and I choose to focus on the books. And I think that's a good choice for a writer obviously.
Definitely, yeah. And I don't know if you keep up on these things, but they announced just recently that first of all, the seasons of the show might actually overtake the books. They might come out, the story might progress on the show before it progresses in the books with how long he's taking to get the seventh book out. And so they've announced that essentially the ending and the plot of the TV show is going to head in a different direction than the books. They're writing them completely differently now.
Yes, and they have other writers doing the actual writing. Plus, they just announced that the seventh book is not going to be published in 2015. So I think Martin has a lot of angry fans.
Yeah, I think so. I think he skipped Comic-Con, or he's going to skip Comic-Con because he says he's working on the seventh book. So hopefully it'll come out soon.
Hopefully. He did leave us on a cliffhanger.
Getting back to Perseus, if Shoot the Devil teases readers with a few socio-political and religious themes buried underneath a Golden Age story, the Perseus books come right out and they slap the reader across the face with them. When you first started the series, did you have a particular agenda? Maybe that's too strong of a word. Did you have a particular worldview in mind that you were trying to explore? Did you have a point you were trying to make, or was it purely about exploring?
It was mostly about exploring. I mean, Perseus was essentially my first attempt at building a novel, let alone a series, which requires different skill set, obviously, from writing a short story. Especially since I realized that I have been writing for maybe 20 years now. But I first got published in 2009, and that was for my short stories. So Schism was the very first thing that I ended up publishing. And it is very much an exploratory piece, and at some point I'd like to rewrite the whole Schism novel and make it from a novelette, which is now, to a proper novel, so maybe bringing it up to 100,000 words or so. And the thing I'd like to do more is focus on characters, because right now, like you point out, I focus more on the world building and the political aspect of things.
Do you have specific directions that you want to take characters? I'm assuming you're heavily influenced. Yeah, as you mentioned, you're influenced by George R. R. Martin, and he's one who's known in his books for balancing character development and the world building and these huge overarching interweaving plot lines. Is that where you're taking a lot of your inspiration?
Yes, but also from everything I see around us. I mean, as well as I do, being a science fiction fan, that science fiction is never about the future. It's all about the present, and it's essentially a commentary on what's happening right now. So it's either where are we going from where we are now, or a metaphor for whatever we see going on around us. And I see a lot of things that scare me, if you like. So I see a rise of fascism again, and a rise of religious intolerance, and all that is brought into the story. If you remember in Schism, for example, I mentioned how they are forced, Christians and Muslims, for example, and Taoists and Buddhists, they are forced to build common temples. And I always thought that was an interesting concept of mine that nobody seems to have picked up upon, which is the joint temples. And I describe one of those temples and what effect it had on the people. What I'd like to do is go further into that exploration of what would happen to the actual people that were born on the planet, and they had these different influences. One is the natives, if you like, and one is the baggage that it carried on with them back from planet Earth. So that's the sort of storytelling I wanted to do with Perseus, and I hope I've been able to do it, especially with the next episodes, like books Rise of the Prince, Mad Water, and especially Vigil, which I think are more philosophical in nature rather than political. And I also think that they manage to describe the characters in much sharper terms.
Has writing these books, the four that you've written in Perseus, has it changed your opinions and your views at all? Has delving into some of the heavy themes and examining them from the different angles that you use in the story, has it changed your viewpoints at all? Have you seen yourself evolve as the series evolved? or are you able to stay pretty detached from it?
No, I can't say that I'm detached in any sort of. I mean, that's very much my child, and you can't stay detached from your child. But I don't know how much you could say it has changed me as much as it has allowed me to clarify what I think and what I believe in. So, for example, it dawned on me just how strongly I feel about the nature of evil, for example. And if you've noticed on Perseus, nobody is purely evil. So you have the antagonist, who's Theo Altman, and he's based on a real character, of course, in ancient Greece and ancient Athens. So a lot of the things that happen, actually, of the story arcs, they are based on real events that happened in antiquity. And Theo Altman is just an example of that. So he is somebody who, in my mind, is a particularly interesting character just because he is the antagonist. And I've struggled very hard to make him an insecure character who is overcompensating for his insecurities and his physical defects, but not at all an evil one. So he will do evil things, but then again I go to extreme pains to show that everybody will do evil things when they're forced to. So I try very hard to put everything in a sort of moral gray zone instead of having the usual black and white, rather manichaistic approach to the philosophical aspects of good versus evil.
Do you have any additional stories planned for the series? You know, as you mentioned, it's the original trilogy, it's the trilogy, and then the most recent one, Schism, is a prequel to that trilogy. Is there more of the story to tell? Do you have other books planned?
There is just one more, which is going to tie up the story arc, and there is the main event that's going to happen, which is the invasion of the capital invades Anthea, and there is a big battle, which is essentially the battle at Marathon Bay. And what happens afterwards, where I'd like the whole thing to become circular in nature. So 300 years later, I'd like to see them go back to something closer to what they had when they first arrived, a sort of innocence and sort of rebuilding everything from scratch.
You seem like you're able to be really incredibly productive as a writer. You mentioned that you had some of your first short stories published back in 2009. The publication date, at least here on Amazon in the States, for Perseus: Rise of the Prince, I think is just last year. Is that accurate, or is that just when it was published over here?
It's 2013, actually, and it was September 2013 that I published Schism and Rise of the Prince. I wanted to have two books ready by the time I first published, because from a marketing point of view, it makes much more sense, and it makes it much easier to promote them. The first publication, which was 2009, was for a short story that was published in a Greek magazine, actually, a magazine that's given away with a Sunday newspaper, and it had comics. But they also included, for some reason, a short story, which was a delightful little addition as far as I'm concerned. And usually those were translated from abroad, so you'd get an introduction, if you like, to what's happening in the States or whatever. However, they very rarely had something by Greek authors. And when I realized that, I was like, why don't I have a shot at this? You know, I'll just shoot them a story and see what happens. And I was amazed that they actually accepted to publish it, let alone that they actually paid me for it. I was like, I could get used to this. This is so much fun, you know. So
yeah, certainly, and there aren't many authors out there who have such early success that you've had. I mean, all of the Perseus books have made it onto Amazon bestseller lists. Power of Six made it there. You also have a children's book I mentioned, Runaway Smile, which freely available through through your website to go and read it directly on the website. But you also do sell that on Amazon, and I know you're working on getting print editions out.
Absolutely. I do have a print edition out, which is on Amazon. I do have a Greek edition out, which is also available on print, and that's traditionally published, by the way. So that was another interesting development, that I got a Greek publisher to publish it. And as far as I'm concerned, honestly, Runaway Smile is probably my best work. I just love it so much. I'm very fond of that little piece, and it's a very short story, but I'm tremendously fond of it.
Who did the illustrations for that?
Oh, that was Dimitris Fousakis, and actually I published on my blog today a dedication effectively to him, a post all about him and his work. He's a childhood friend. We grew up together. I mean, I've known him since I was like 12, and I, we had, grown apart in a sense for a while as I moved to the UK and studied there and then started working there. And when I came back, we picked up where we had left a few years later. And he mentioned, I think that was again 2009 or thereabouts, he mentioned that he was working on children's books and he was an illustrator. So I showed him this little poem that I had jotted down, which is just a silly thing to pass the time. And he loved it, and he suggested that I turn it into a book. So that's where Runaway Smile sprang from.
I guess my main question, hearing everything that you've done and hearing everything that you're working on, is how can you possibly have the time to do all of this? You do have a day job, right? You have a doctorate in digital architecture. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes. Well, nice research. And yes, I do have a day job. I have a company that we just moved back to the UK. Actually, it was based in Greece for the past 15 years, but with the current financial and economical climate over here, it just made little sense to keep it here. I mean, I'll just say this on the subject. In the past 12 months, we had 144 tax changes to the tax code. So you can well imagine that I have no idea what the hell is going to happen here and what's happening. And in the end, you just give up and you go like, I'm just going to move the company to a place that I know what's going to happen tomorrow, because I just don't know what's going to happen tomorrow with the tax and the regulations and what's going to be asked of us. So anyway, it's now a UK company. Yes.
So with all these different things going on with this company and with your writing and all your projects, what's your daily routine like? How much time do you even have to write on a daily basis?
I actually joke about this, that I have the routine of an athlete or a monk, because I wake up at around 8 o'clock and then I start writing and then I start working on the social media. Then I break to work on Insta Media, of course. Stop for some lunch. Stop for a nap at around 5 o'clock, and then work some more between 6 and 8. Watch something with my wife, a lecture, between 8 and 10, and then work some more between 10 and 12. So it's a very rigid program, and I can't say I do much in the entertainment department, if you like, but to me, writing is so much fun, and it's a strange thing, because whenever I do anything else, it's like a small part of my head just goes, why aren't you writing now? Wouldn't that be better than what you're doing at the moment? And when I'm writing, it's the only time when that voice is finally silenced.
Would you say that your goal is to be a full-time writer? You know, if you could get rid of all the other work, would you do that, and would you just write?
Yes, absolutely. That is my goal. I would say I'd say that's my medium-term goal.
And how close would you say that you are to reaching that goal?
Well, I didn't say it was my short-term goal, so that answers your question. I only sell about maybe 30 to 50 books if I do closer to 50 books when I do no advertisements at all. And when I run an advertisement, it can run up to 300, 400 copies. That's usually where I'm at the moment. So obviously I need to sell a lot more before I can quit my day job. But as I often joke, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So starting off, I knew that I was not going to be a runaway success, what they call an overnight success. And I have this saying that I've seen somewhere, and I just loved it, which was that usually you spend 10 years before you can become an overnight success.
I think that sounds about right. As you said, you've got this pretty stringent daily routine. Do you ever have a time where you just don't want to do it, where you need a break? How do you keep yourself motivated? What keeps you coming back to the creative process and to writing?
By not forcing it. Writing nowadays, especially if you're an indie author, and I'm largely an indie author, I'm a hybrid author as I define myself, but a lot of what I do is just indie author stuff. So it has so many aspects, from designing a book cover or promoting yourself or building your platform or networking or just getting to know new people. And I love all of it. I mean, I'm one of those weird people where even the marketing part does not scare me, probably because the day job has to do a lot with internet marketing, and I've been doing it for the past 20 years or so. So I actually enjoy even that part. And just because I can do that, I can spend 10 days without doing any writing, just because there is so much other stuff to do, especially around a book launch date. So actually, at the moment, that's what I'm doing. I'm taking a break. I've only written the first chapter of the final book of Perseus, and I'm getting ready to publish Museville, which is the second children's book. So I haven't done any writing in about 10 days. And that's okay. I'm not worried. I'm not stressed about it. When I miss it, and I do miss it on occasion, I go back and write something down. So in those 10 days, I've written a short story, for example.
Certainly, and I find myself, I'm the same way, and it's difficult to define it, I guess, because so much of what you do otherwise, to say how often do you write, and when you and I talk about writing, it has to do with creating a story and writing a piece of fiction. But the reality of it is that even if I'm not, quote unquote, writing on a daily basis, I'm creating content for the website. I'm out there doing marketing, like you say, and so much of everything is writing, and even just doing that allows you to sort of stretch your writing muscles and keep yourself in form. You don't need to sit down. If you're just a fiction writer, if that's all you're doing, and especially when you're just starting out, you do need to sit down and work on it every day and have a word count that you're striving for. But once you're in a good groove, and once you know what you're doing, and once it starts coming naturally to you, it is easier to kind of put yourself on autopilot and just go where the inspiration and where the needs of the particular day take you.
I couldn't agree more, especially about the blog. I blog almost daily, and I found that has actually done wonders for my writing, surprisingly enough.
Who would you say your biggest influences are as a writer?
I think I've mentioned this to you before. It's Philip K. Dick, if I had to choose one. I just love him. I mean, he taught me everything I've learned about short story writing. And he has this wonderful way of jumping into the story and creating these memorable characters with just a few words, which I really admire. And at the same time, he has a very spiritual aspect to his writing, which I don't think many people realize. But especially if you read his, what was the Exegesis. It's his book. It's a huge book. It's about 1,000 pages long, where he explains what he calls his anamnesis, or his recalling of a memory. And he's had a number of interesting psychedelic almost experiences, I don't know if you're aware of this, that have a lot to do with what you would call archetypes, presumably. And I don't know, I just found the whole thing incredibly fascinating. So whenever I need some inspiration, I just flick through that. And he always has something to give me. It's amazing.
Yeah, I certainly count Philip K. Dick among my influences. The twist endings of many of his short stories. I always look to those for inspiration, and I try to do a little bit of that in my writing. My short story Mazap Fall in the first issue of Non-Local, it has a little bit of that. I don't pretend to be anywhere near the master at it that Philip K. Dick was. You mentioned. I never specifically heard about his psychedelic experiences and things. I have heard that he used to go on binges where he would write for days, consuming nothing but potassium tablets and whiskey, which I always found pretty unbelievable.
I know what you mean. Apparently, he had this experience when he experimented with taking incredible amounts of vitamin C and vitamins, which is just bizarre. So water-soluble vitamins, that was his trip, if you can believe it. And it triggered some sort of weird reaction where he thought that he could predict the future, and he did have a couple of very weird experiences that he describes. Also, I have to say about Mazel Tov.
Mazap Fall?
Yes. It was, I think it was my favorite story in the whole book, the whole magazine. I just loved it, and I loved the ending. I have to say, I've told you this in writing, but I have to say it live as well. I just loved it. I thought it was brilliant.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I came out of absolute left field for me. Other things I've written in the past have been pretty hard sci-fi. That one was, I think I was just trying to write something on the soft sci-fi side of things, and that's just what came out. I got a bit lucky, I think.
We all feel that way when we do something that works. I know what you mean. It's almost like it's not your doing. You just become a medium, in a sense, a channel through which something is written, but you have no idea just what the hell it came from, where it came from, what it is, and sometimes it just feels like somebody else wrote it. And I seem to remember a lot of authors talking about this. I mean, I remember Richard Bach, for example, when he wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which is another one of my favorite books. He said that he wrote in a weekend, and it was just like somebody had whispered it in his ear. He just sat there and wrote down everything that came to him. I kind of felt like something was dictated to me when I was writing Runaway Smile as well.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's just you get into a groove with it, and suddenly your muse just takes over, and you're able to, the Stephen King, I think it was in On Writing, the memoirs of the craft, his book, his memoirs and his little treatise on writing talked about how the more you write, I think it was him, the more you write, the more it kind of breaks down the barrier between your mind and the page. And that's how I always sort of think about it, is that at some point it just becomes so natural, and the words go directly from your brain onto the screen or onto the page, and you're not even consciously thinking about it. It's just happening. And so after the fact, I can see how I can see how so many authors are just amazed and don't know where certain things come from.
I agree, and I've studied a lot of psychology as well. I mean, especially Jungian psychology and analytical psychology. So I have developed this theory that was actually part of my thesis, my PhD thesis, about creativity and how, in my mind, it originates from the unconscious, but it's essentially what we put on paper is the everyday experiences as they are metamorphosed by the archetypes that dwell in the unconscious.
Something that you and I have in common, aside from our love for Golden Age sci-fi writers, is our interest in independent, specifically digital publishing. You write very frequently on your blog about different strategies for becoming successful as an indie author. Why, for you personally, why are you so passionate about self-publishing rather than focusing on getting a manuscript accepted by an established publishing house?
A lot of reasons, mainly because the latter is not available to a lot of people. I mean, if you think about it logically, you have something like 6,500 books published daily. So you can imagine, if you are a publisher, how many of these can you realistically have a look at? And for a lot of people, it's not that they don't know how to write or they write horrible books. It's just that nobody gets around to actually reading them. And I hate that. I hate the notion that there is a beautiful book out there that nobody's ever going to read. It's going to stay in a drawer forever just because nobody gave it a chance. And realistically, again, that's going to happen. It's going to happen, and there's nothing we can do about it. So now that we have, for the first time in history perhaps, the ability to publish digitally and to allow at least everybody a shot at this, why shouldn't we do it? Just because we want to have a seal of approval, it just doesn't make sense to me. So I love freedom, for example. It's a big part of my psychological makeup. I have this need to feel free, and this is a sort of thing that makes me feel free. Whereas 50 years or 20 years even ago, we wouldn't have this ability. So in my mind, it's just crazy to sit around waiting for somebody to say, yeah, I approve of your manuscript, you can now publish it, you may now publish it, when you have the ability to do so yourself.
You found, and this is a loaded term, and everyone has a different definition, but you seem to have found a decent amount of success in a relatively short amount of time. What would you say is the most important thing for new authors to try to make it as self-publishers? If you were starting over again from the beginning, or you were talking to someone who's starting over from the beginning, where would you say to keep your focus, and where would you say to work hardest?
It's going to sound silly, but my focus would be on having fun. It's very hard to do what we do because it has so many moving components, and you have to have a very specific mindset and a very specific way of doing things, and you have to know how to motivate yourself. You have to know how to work long hours without complaining. You have to do all that, and if you are not having fun while doing them, I can't possibly see how somebody can do it. So in my mind, the most important thing is to enjoy yourself while you're doing it, and if you stop enjoying yourself, then stop doing it. If a part of it stresses you, then I think it's hugely important that you drop that part and focus on whatever it is that allows you to have a good time and enjoy yourself. Because otherwise, I honestly see you burning yourself out in a question of days, if not weeks, if not days.
Where do you see publishing heading in the next few years or the next few decades? Are we going to be in the long tail of print publishing for the foreseeable future, or do you think we're heading for a tipping point where digital is going to dominate pretty quickly? Or is there maybe a third option?
I don't know. I think people are always going to buy paper just because they love it. But I also see a lot of, especially the young people, reading on their cells, the mobile phones, and on tablets. So I think that's taken off already. So I see digital publishing overtaking print, although print is always going to be around in one form or another. I mean, I always try to predict what's going to happen with publishing by looking at the music industry, because I think there is a lot in common there. And what I've seen from the music industry is that LPs, for example, are back in fashion, which presumably nobody could foresee a few years ago. But they're seen as something beautiful, a thing of beauty, not just something to listen music on. And I think the same thing is going to happen with books. So I see publishing companies becoming, in a sense, more focused on the aesthetics and on producing something that's eye candy, if you like, for book lovers. At the same time, a lot of things are going to change. I can see a lot of the publishing companies focusing, well, hopefully, more on keeping their authors happy, because right now I think they don't realize what a huge capital they have in the form of authors, and they tend to take them for granted. So Amazon has changed all that and has spoiled authors, if you like, by, say, giving us almost instant data on how many copies we've sold. And whenever a publisher comes and says, okay, I don't have your data yet, I'll probably have it in 3 months' time, that just sounds so wrong and so weird to somebody used to the Amazon model. So I see a huge pressure on the publishers to change. So that's why I said I believe everybody's going to be a hybrid publisher, author in a few years' time. They are going to have some works that are going to publish the traditional channels, and some works that could be more experimental, or it could be the ones that the publisher are not interested in, or it could be even under a pseudonym that they choose to self-publish for whatever reason. And I encourage that. I think, like I said, I have this huge need to feel free, and that allows me to feel as free as possible. And you don't have the contracts that bind you. You don't have, you keep all the rights to yourself. And even with my traditional publisher here in Greece, I managed to negotiate something that would allow me to keep the rights to my work. And again, I see that as hopefully becoming the norm more and more as time goes by, and as things progress.
So, and this is putting you on the spot a little bit. If HarperCollins were to call you up tomorrow and say, hey, we love the Perseus series, we want to offer you a publishing contract and put it out tomorrow, but you've got to stick to the way that we do things, and we're not going to allow you to keep up your digital footprint. You've got to come over and be a traditional big house print author. Would you do it?
I think everything in life is about cost benefits, essentially cost benefit analysis. So yes, the answer is probably, I would probably do it. I would have to look at the details and see exactly. For example, if they said, but you can never self-publish anything ever again, I would have a huge problem with that. Or if they said, but we get to keep every single right and we give you a flat fee of $10,000, I would have to decline that, because I honestly believe that Perseus is worth more than that. And I'd like to keep some of the rights at least. But again, it's a question of a cost benefit, and I find so much in life is about that.
Right. Obviously, there's a lot of gray area. You can't just say yes or no to a question like that, which is
well. But I also don't say no to a question like that. So I'd be more than happy. Obviously, I would be terribly flattered if something like that were to happen. So the answer is yes. I would be delighted to discuss it.
Right, and I think that's a big part of the sort of the public side of the debate between digital and print, is that these established publishers, the Big Five in New York, whoever you're talking about, because the public knows and trusts them, because these are the publishers that have been putting out the books that everybody has loved for the past, century, there are so many vagaries and so much gray area, but the big five are able, on the public face of it, to say, nope, we've done it this way forever. You guys like it this way. Why should you have anything? Why should you even listen to these independent authors over here? So many of them are unprofessional, and they're putting out stuff that isn't any good. So just ignore them and stick with us. We know what we're doing.
Yes, and there's a market for that, so that's fine. It's a bit like music, isn't it? I mean, you get Sony, which has produced and represented an awful lot of wonderful artists and musicians, but at the same time, you have a thriving indie scene, and that's okay as well. I mean, there's no reason why we should all listen to nothing but Sony artists or nothing but indie artists, and I think it's okay to have a mixtape if you like. Simple as that.
I think that's a great philosophy to have. I think we need to learn to work together rather than pitting print against digital until one eventually wins. Once again, I've been talking to Nicholas Rossis, author of the short story Shoot the Devil, which appears in the first issue of Non-Local Science Fiction, available now through nonlocalsci-fi.com and major ebook retailers like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and iBooks. Thanks for being here, Nicholas.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Quantum Flux, the podcast of Non-Local Science Fiction Magazine and nonlocalsci-fi.com. Join me next week when I'll be talking to Jim Rudnick, author of the short story The Assistant Portkeeper, which appears in issue number 1 of Non-Local Science Fiction. Subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or our YouTube channel so that you never miss an episode. Music was provided by Kevin MacLeod through Incomtech.com.